Scary and creepy bone-chilling paranormal encounter stories. There's something in my grandma's basement, and it's getting worse. For some background, when I was 6, my grandparents and I moved into a new house. My grandpa had just had a stroke and could no longer manage stairs, so we found a one-story house that seemed perfect. I've always been able to feel weird energy. My friend calls me an empath, though she says I'm not as sensitive as she is. My dad claims he can sense spirits too, but the rest of the family, on my mom's side, seems completely unaware of anything paranormal. When we moved into the house, I didn't feel anything strange until I went into the basement. I know this probably sounds like the setup for a cliche horror movie, but I really need someone to take this seriously. Something is down there, and I think it might be dangerous. The first time I went into the basement, I felt like I couldn't breathe. It was a thick, suffocating feeling, like something was pressing down on me. As a kid, I didn't understand what was happening. I just knew I hated going down there. Whenever my grandma sent me down to grab something, I'd inch my way down, grab it, and bolt back upstairs. She used to joke that I got my daily cardio that way. She never felt anything unusual down there. When I was around 12, my aunt and her 11-year-old son moved in with us after her divorce. My cousin had a lot of behavioral issues, partly from the divorce and partly due to underlying mental health problems. We ended up spending a lot of time in the basement because it was the only place to escape the grown-up drama upstairs, especially when the weather kept us from playing outside. Even though I still hated being down there, I chalked it up to me just being paranoid. But every time I spent time in that basement, it felt worse. I could never stay down there for more than an hour. It was like I physically couldn't. Once my aunt and cousin moved out, I started avoiding the basement again. I was around 14 when I first told a friend about it, and she suggested it might be haunted. She gave me sage to cleanse the space, but it didn't do anything. I moved out at 18 into my boyfriend's dad's house. A year later, my grandma asked me to house sit while she went on vacation. No boyfriends allowed. I tried to stay the first night alone, but I couldn't even sit in the living room for more than 30 minutes without having a full-blown panic attack. I ended up calling my boyfriend to stay over anyway. One night, while we were watching YouTube on the Roku, we heard a loud crash from somewhere in the house. Terrified someone had broken in, my boyfriend grabbed a knife and searched the place. Everything was locked. Nothing was out of place. We didn't sleep much that night. When my grandma came home, we left as soon as she walked in. Later, she called and asked if we'd gone into the basement. We hadn't. She told us that a box of VHS tapes, which had been sitting untouched on the floor, was scattered across the room. Whatever caused that crash came from the basement. Up until that point, nothing physical had ever happened. That was the first time it crossed the line into something tangible and violent. Months later, my grandma asked me to go down to the basement to get a few things for her. Her back was bothering her, so I reluctantly agreed. I went down, found what she needed, and while I was looking, something terrifying happened. I felt disconnected, like I was no longer in control of my body. I watched myself pull out my phone and try to download a Spirit Box app with this overwhelming feeling of I want to talk to you. That had never happened before. It had never wanted me there, and it had never tried to communicate. That shook me to my core. I ran out of there and made excuses for it, told myself it was just my own curiosity or anxiety. But after that, I started having panic attacks anytime I was alone. Even after moving out, if I'm by myself in my apartment for too long, I spiral. I'm convinced this thing messed with my mental health. For a while, I wrote it off as my own paranoia. That is, until recently. My friends and I have been playing Dungeons and Dragons at my grandma's house. We usually played in the enclosed porch, but it's gotten too cold lately. My grandma suggested we move to the basement since it stays warm. Reluctantly, I agreed and brought two of my friends down to show them around. One of them is the empath I mentioned earlier. The other is a total skeptic, completely dismissive of anything paranormal. The basement is shaped like a J. To the left of the stairs is the top, the right is the bottom, and the curve is at the back. I showed them the top of the J first, since it was the most spacious. As usual, I felt that tight, suffocating pressure on my chest. But then both of my friends, including the skeptic, said they felt the same thing. We moved toward the curved part of the basement to escape it. At first, it felt better. But then the empath whispered, "It just walked over to us." The skeptic, visibly disturbed, said it was no longer in the spot where we first felt it. It had moved. I had to grab a few things before we left, and once we were back upstairs, I brushed it off again. But then, an hour later, the skeptic messaged our group chat saying he'd been having nightmares about the basement and would never go back down there again. That's when I realized this was serious. Now, my aunt and her kids, including a new 12-year-old cousin, are moving back in temporarily. I'm terrified for them. This thing has shown it can manipulate, physically lash out, and seriously mess with people's mental states. My cousin is young, vulnerable, and curious about the paranormal. That makes her an easy target. My grandma is 81 and fragile. My aunt is overwhelmed, stressed, and trying to support two kids on her own. They don't know what they're dealing with. I don't know what this thing is. I don't know if it's a spirit, a demon, or something else entirely. But I know it's dangerous. It has gotten stronger over time, and I'm scared it's not done yet. If anyone has any idea what this could be, or how to get rid of it, I'm all ears. My friends are scared of the basement. I'm scared for the people living above it. I predicted my grandfather's death, and I still don't know what to make of it. This all started back in 2019. At the time, I was dealing with frequent, intrusive thoughts, those random, unwelcome ideas that pop into your mind out of nowhere. But what made them different and honestly terrifying was that some of them started coming true within minutes of me thinking them. Two incidents have stuck with me, even years later. The first was after my grandfather had undergone surgery to remove a cancerous tumor. He was recovering well, and I was helping him out with work. Then, out of nowhere, I had this intrusive thought. What if my grandpa fell? He just had surgery. What if something goes wrong? I brushed it off. It was just a strange, dark thought. But minutes later, he fell. It wasn't anything life-threatening, but it shook me. The timing was too uncanny. At that point in my life, I was having a lot of these thoughts, intrusive moments that somehow ended up reflecting reality. But this one was so specific that it changed how I viewed everything. I became extremely paranoid about every negative thought that crossed my mind. I didn't want anything else to come true. Fast forward to Christmas Eve later that same year. We were having dinner at my dad's house, and I was supposed to go pick up my grandfather and bring him over. While I was getting ready, another thought struck me. What if we get there and my grandpa's dead? Like something out of a movie, he dies on Christmas. It was such a bizarre and uncomfortable thought. Even though he'd recently beaten cancer, he was doing fine. There was no reason for it. I felt strange for even thinking it. But we got to his house and he was fine. Alive, well, and ready for Christmas dinner. We brought him over, and the night went on as usual. I told myself I was just being weird. Then came Christmas Day, December 25th, 2019. That morning, my grandfather went fishing, which was normal for him. Nothing unusual. But a few hours later, my dad called me. My grandfather had died in a car accident. It was Christmas Day. I didn't know how to process it. I wasn't sad at first. I was numb. I couldn't feel anything. After that, I became overly protective of the people I cared about, constantly fearing something would happen to them. I didn't want to think anymore. I didn't trust my thoughts. Since my grandfather passed, I haven't had any intrusive thoughts that have come true. I still have a strong intuition, but nothing like what I experienced that year. And strangely, almost all of those premonition-like thoughts were about my grandfather. The weird thing is, we weren't even that close. Our bond wasn't anything special on the surface. But looking back, I can't shake the feeling that there was some kind of spiritual connection between us during that last year of his life. Or maybe it was all just one huge coincidence. I still haven't talked about this with many people. Only my mom and my best friend know. Until now, I've kept it to myself. But it's something I think about all the time. A spirit visited me in a hotel, and it was surprisingly peaceful. Just for some background, I grew up in a very haunted house. Most of the spirits were benevolent, and over time, I got used to their presence. Thanks to both my upbringing and my spiritual beliefs, I've developed a comfort with light spirit work. So, encounters with the paranormal aren't new or frightening for me. In fact, I often find them fascinating. Recently, my wife and I took a short weekend trip to Ashland, Oregon, just to get away from the stress of everyday life. We stayed at a recently renovated hotel in an area with known paranormal activity, although no incidents had ever been reported at this specific hotel. Since it was part of a chain, I wasn't really expecting anything unusual. But something did happen. I woke up around 3:30 a.m. feeling uncomfortably warm, even though we had the AC on full blast, set to 62 degrees. I assumed I was just dehydrated. I've been struggling with hydration lately due to work-related stress. I rolled onto my back to reach for my water bottle, and that's when I felt something strange, cool hair brushing against my face. I immediately knew it wasn't my wife's. Her shampoo has a very distinct scent, and based on how she was sleeping, there was no way her hair could have reached my face. Still, I drank some water, brushed it off, and rolled over to go back to sleep. That's when things got more interesting. I suddenly felt a weight behind me, like someone lying on top of the sheets. Then there was a tingling sensation on my leg, moving gently up and down. I initially chalked it up to my back issues acting up and tried to ignore it. But the sensation grew stronger. The pressure on the blanket increased, and then I felt a sudden coldness spread across my back and stomach. That same light brush of hair touched my back, and again, it couldn't have been my wife. She was still right in front of me, and I was cuddling her. This continued for nearly an hour. And then, just like that, the pressure lifted, my body temperature returned to normal, and everything felt calm again. Now, Under most circumstances, I might assume this was sleep paralysis, but I was fully able to move the entire time. There were no visual or auditory hallucinations, and once I fully woke up, I didn't feel afraid or drained. Quite the opposite. There was a surprising sense of peace. It was as if the experience had lifted a weight off my chest. My stress was gone. I felt lighter, brighter. It was, without a doubt, the most pleasant paranormal experience I've ever had. Still, just to be safe, I gently but firmly instructed the spirit to stay at the hotel and not follow me home. When we got back, I even repositioned my home security camera to face inside, just in case my message wasn't received. So far, everything's quiet, but if anything changes, I'll post updates. Now, it's back to work at a haunted hospital of all places. My time working security at a haunted hospital. Years ago, I worked security at an old hospital that had more history and more strangeness than most. Originally built in 1924, it was a 6-story, 2-building hospital with an extra wing just for pediatrics, and like many old hospitals, it also had a morgue in the basement. In 2008, a new hospital was built across town, and most of the original facility was abandoned. Only the emergency room, short stay, and rehab wings remained in use. Everything else, including the pediatric wing, the old operating rooms, and the morgue, was left to sit and decay. The place was eerie even without the ghost stories. But considering how many people had died there over the decades, it wasn't too surprising that we started having strange experiences. We'd joked that the hospital was haunted, but deep down I believed it. We'd often hear what sounded like children laughing in the old pediatric wing when no one was there. Shadows would move just out of sight, and sometimes objects would shift or disappear when no one was looking. Creepy, sure. But after so many nights of this, it started to feel routine. I always approached the spirits respectfully. I would tell them they didn't have to hide from me unless I was dealing with something job-related. Oddly enough, that seemed to work. I usually had 2 or 3 minor encounters a night, nothing malicious. Just presence. Eventually, I left that job for a better opportunity. Not long after, the hospital made the decision to demolish the abandoned sections, including the old morgue and the basement corridors that had been used to transport bodies. Fast forward a few years, I found myself working security again, now assigned to what remained of the old hospital. Coming back felt heavy, like the building still held onto all that history, even the parts that were now rubble. During one shift, I found a quiet spot and decided to check in with whatever spirits might still be around. I greeted them respectfully, let them know the rules. No touching, no following me home, and absolutely no jump scares. I also told them I was open to communication as long as those boundaries were respected. Not long after that, I saw a nun walking through the main lobby. Nothing unusual. It is a Catholic hospital, after all. But instead of heading toward the current chapel, she went the opposite way, toward where the chapel used to be. I followed, planning to redirect her, but she turned a corner and vanished. I just chuckled to myself. I knew what that meant. Later that night, I was using one of the more secluded restrooms, ones only staff and maybe the occasional guest would know about. While I was in there, I heard a loud sigh come from the stall behind me. Then a toilet flushed and the automatic door opened. Naturally, I expected to see someone leave, but no one came out. I checked the stalls. All of them were empty. That was my confirmation that I wasn't crazy all those years ago, and that the unexplained still happens here. Eventually, I was transferred to the newer hospital campus, which is far less paranormal activity. But before I left the old site, I had a few final encounters. One of the more common things was hearing disembodied voices echo down the hall, asking things like, "Is someone there?" It felt like the ghosts were the ones doing the ghost hunting. They were curious about us. I'd laugh the second or third time it happened, because honestly, it felt like something straight out of a ghost hunting show. Of course, I had to check each time, just in case a patient had wandered somewhere off limits or a homeless person had found shelter. But the areas were always empty. And whenever I stopped and tried to communicate directly, no response. Could have been residual hauntings or spirits just passing through. The moment that stood out the most came on my last day before transferring. As usual, I made my quiet offer to communicate and reminded any spirits around of the ground rules. No touching, no scaring, and no hitching a ride home. That night was uneventful until the end of my shift, when my supervisor found me looking irritated. He asked why I hadn't answered my radio. I was confused. I checked it, it was off. Now, our radios are kept in protective covers to guard against rain, and those covers make it nearly impossible to accidentally hit the power or volume knobs. There's no way it could have turned off on its own. Turns out, my supervisor had been trying to reach me because a psych ward officer had been injured during an altercation and needed to be replaced. It could have easily been me who was sent in. Some people would say it was just a weird coincidence. But I've always leaned toward believing the spirits I'd been respectful to over the years appreciated that. And maybe, just maybe, one of them was looking out for me. I saw something unexplainable at Fremantle Prison. For a bit of background, I'm a 19-year-old female, and this happened when I was about 10, during year 5. At the time, I had just moved to Western Australia to live with my mom and stepdad. The transition was rough. New school, new siblings, and a lot of emotional baggage from the abuse I experienced in my previous home. Year 4 was tough, but by year 5, things had started to settle. I still struggled with my mental health, but I was finally in a safer place, making friends, and trying to just be a normal kid again. A few months before my birthday, my class and another year 5 class planned a school excursion to Fremantle Prison as part of a history lesson. I was a bit anxious. I didn't know much about the prison, and unfamiliar places made me uneasy, but I had my friends with me, which helped calm my nerves. When we arrived, our tour guide began walking us through the old prison. I was fascinated. The architecture, the stories, the layout, it was eerie, but it also felt like stepping into a different time. Eventually, the guide led us up to the second floor and stopped near a railing above a net. He explained the net had been installed to prevent prisoners from jumping or from pushing others off the upper level. It was a grim fact, but part of the prison's dark history. As he talked, I remember looking down the hallway where the cells were. I was holding my friend's hand because the crowd was making me anxious. I wasn't really paying attention, just letting my eyes wander until I saw something. Or rather, someone. He looked real. Not a shadow or trick of the light, a fully visible man. He seemed middle-aged, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s, wearing only white underwear. There was a large wound on his head. We locked eyes. I stared at him for what felt like 10 solid seconds. Then, without a word or sound, he turned and walked into one of the cells. The door was closed. He walked through it like it wasn't even there. My whole body went cold. I squeezed my friend's hand tighter and shuffled behind them, trying to hide. They noticed and asked what was wrong, but I couldn't answer. My voice was gone, like it had just shut off. After a moment, they gave up trying to get a response and assumed I was just spooked by the suicide story. They wrapped an arm around me and kept me close. Now, I want to make something clear. I've dealt with trauma-induced hallucinations before and still do. But what I saw that day didn't feel like any hallucination I've ever had. Mine are usually vague, dark shapes, shadowy figures, never detailed. Never this real. This man looked like an actual, living person until he vanished. I've never talked to anyone about this, not my therapist, not even close friends. Thinking about it still makes me uneasy. But after nearly a decade of carrying it around in silence, I just needed to get it off my chest. Whatever I saw that day at Fremantle Prison, it left a mark on me. Whether it was a ghost, a residual memory, or something else entirely, I don't know. But it felt real. And I haven't forgotten him. I'm 30 years old and from Australia. The events I'm about to describe began around 15 years ago when I was about 15. My 18-year-old brother was dating a girl named Casey, and one night, the three of us were at home watching a movie. It was one of my first times meeting her, and the evening seemed normal. Then, I suddenly heard a loud female scream in my mind. I was aware it was in my mind, but I'd never experienced anything like it before. It was very strange. I looked at my brother and Casey, who seemed worried. Casey asked if we heard it too. My brother hadn't, but Casey said it was a lost spirit, scared and lost. I was a pretty normal kid at the time, playing rugby, hanging out with friends, and hadn't thought deeply about such things before. Casey's explanation scared me. She said she'd dealt with this for years, and now that I'd heard the voice, it would intensify. She also said I was a powerful old soul, and that she would always protect me and not to be afraid. We eventually went to sleep, and the next day, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. A week or so later, my brother, Casey, and I were hanging out in his room, which was a converted garage where my grandfather had passed away 2 years prior, when Casey went into a seizure-like state, shaking uncontrollably and speaking gibberish. My brother was very concerned, but I felt strangely calm. Casey told me to put my hand on her to help her. I placed my hand on her leg, and she stopped shaking, breathing deeply. She said she felt something in the room reacting to my presence. That night, I began to feel the presence of an entity which initially felt like my grandfather. It was an emotional and comforting feeling. The entity seemed to know things only my grandfather would have known about his last moments. Over the next few days, however, I started to get a strange, negative feeling from this entity. Over the next few months, Casey had more of these seizures in front of me, and she used me as a healer. I was never scared, remaining calm, and she relied on me to protect her from these events. Eventually, we were on a family trip to the beach when my brother, Casey, and I decided to use a Ouija board. We were in a kind of underground room during a storm. The room had a small, high window and a door that led to an outside area on ground level. As soon as we started the Ouija board, there was a very intense feeling in the room. Before we could even ask any questions, the doorknob on the outside of the door fell off, locking us in. My brother panicked, but I calmly climbed through the window to let us out. We stopped using the Ouija board, but after that, the entity posing as my grandfather became very dark. It began telling me that to unlock my full potential, I needed to make a great sacrifice, eventually saying I needed to kill my brother. I had nightmares of killing him and writing on the walls in blood. I woke up feeling watched and began to lose my calmness. Not long after, Casey abruptly broke up with my brother, leaving him deeply depressed. In retrospect, this was better than me killing him. My brother and I began drinking together a lot in his room, and we had some very intense experiences with the entity. My brother told me about Casey doing witchcraft rituals in the room. He said he never heard the entity speak, but felt watched and sensed its hatred. One night, my brother, his friend Paul, and I were drinking in his room, having a good time, when I suddenly felt the entity's presence. I saw Paul looking in that area, and he suddenly clenched his fists and started breathing heavily, as if he wanted to kill someone. I immediately grabbed Paul to comfort him. He started screaming at my brother. After I calmed him down, my brother asked what happened. Paul said he didn't know. He just got the sudden urge to hurt him. We explained everything we'd been going through. This was significant for me because it confirmed that something real was happening if 3 separate people had the urge to harm my brother without knowing what the others had experienced. I'm skipping some other events, but essentially more of the same stuff was happening. Then, one night, my brother, Paul, and 2 of my brother's friends, Frank and Kate, were over. I had a very dark feeling about Frank all night, as it was my first time meeting him. After drinking, Frank suddenly stood up and went toward the bookshelf with a box cutter. I knew he was being possessed as soon as he stood up, and as soon as he grabbed the knife, I bear hugged him from behind and grabbed the knife from his hand. Paul rushed over and helped me overpower him. He acted calm, but I still felt the entity possessing him. No one else felt that way. We discussed what had been happening to us. We all went to sleep and were awakened by Kate screaming. We found Frank standing over her, masturbating. We immediately kicked Frank out of the house. I then began to talk to the entity, demanding to know who it was and to leave. It said, "Okay. Well, this is what the WR." It said to me, "I am evil. I was Hitler. I am Aleister Crowley." I didn't know who Aleister Crowley was. I told my brother, and he said that was the guy Led Zeppelin liked. I researched Aleister Crowley and had nightmares and astral projections of being in his house, looking for something and being followed by the entity. I was trying hard to get rid of the entity, as it wanted people to hurt my brother. From what I could feel, it was jealous of my brother and wanted to possess Casey. We tried to reach out to her, but she stopped talking to us. This was about a year after the initial events. Eventually, the entity became less intense and left us alone, mostly. I began to doubt if it was even real, wondering if it was just my imagination as a kid. However, over the next few years, I would get drunk at house parties or with friends and be taken over by it, beating myself and smashing my head into doors and walls. This happened maybe 5 times over a 2-year period from ages 16 to 18. After that, I began smoking weed every day and stopped drinking. The next 3 years were relatively normal. Then, at 20, I had a girlfriend who was very negative, making me depressed and anxious to the point of suicidal thoughts. I was with her for 2 years, and nothing paranormal or strange happened. I had forgotten about that side of myself. Then, I met a friend at my job who was a Christian. His mother also worked with us and was a big member of her church. She eventually invited me to attend. I felt a resistance in me from the entity, but I ignored it, thinking I was just being crazy and that it wasn't real. I began to pray to God to get me out of this depression, and I had two strange events happen while praying. The first was on a hike alone. I asked for a sign that God was watching me and was real. Immediately, I was attacked by about 5 birds. The second time, I was praying in the shower with my eyes closed and felt a negative energy. When I opened my eyes, my girlfriend's face was pressed against the shower door, looking demonic. I screamed at her, and she got very upset. I then invited my girlfriend to my new Christian friend Reno's house while we were smoking weed. Suddenly, Reno's brother became agitated and pulled a knife on his brother. My girlfriend freaked out and wanted to leave. As we were leaving, Reno's father-in-law stopped us and told my girlfriend she was no longer welcome in the house, saying she had brought dark energy into the home. She and I were furious. As I was getting into the car to leave with her, I decided to go back inside to talk to him, feeling it was wrong for them to say they welcome everyone and then say she wasn't welcome. When I went inside, the priest was there and came out of nowhere saying, "Leave, you're not welcome." This shocked me so much that I felt an intense electrical shock through my whole body and fell to the ground, shaking and sweating. The priest, Reno's mother, and aunt grabbed me, praying and screaming, "Leave this boy, you're not welcome in his body." I felt the entity again for the first time in years. It was screaming and burning, and I felt it being pulled out of my body into Reno's mother's hands. I was in pain and felt a burning sensation. Suddenly, I had an urge to lie to them to make it stop, so I acted as if I was cured, crying and saying, "Thank you so much. You saved me." We talked and cried for the next 30 minutes until I convinced them to let me leave. Once I left, I disconnected from Reno and never saw them again. Crocodile tears are not good. The next 2 years, from 22 to 24, were horrible and the worst time of my life. I became incredibly suicidal and shut myself off from everyone. My girlfriend cheated on me when I was 23, and I got even worse. I broke up with her and eventually attempted suicide, but failed. Desperate to get better, I left Canberra, where I grew up, and moved into a friend's house. Then, I experienced a significant change. I stopped smoking weed, which I hadn't done since I was 18, and I met my now wife. From 24 to now, at 30, I've had a normal life. I have a great job, got married, and 2 years ago, had a daughter. It's been a challenge, as my daughter was born with a genetic condition and needs a kidney transplant. I'm going to be her donor, and I'm in the process of that now, but I'm still happy with my life. Nothing paranormal happened after I moved to Sydney. However, over the last 2 months, I've started to feel drawn to those past events, questioning everything that happened back then and realizing some events can't be explained away. About a month ago, I was randomly invited to a concert by my brother and Paul, whom I hadn't seen for 8 years. Right before I saw him, I was listening to a podcast, and as I walked into the concert, the podcast started talking about Aleister Crowley, which I found incredibly strange. Then, after the concert, my brother told me he'd been thinking about Casey a lot recently and felt her visiting him in his dreams. He's now married with a child and hadn't thought about those events for years. He was always skeptical, viewing them as youthful imagination and drunkenness. But now, he's been thinking about them and feels, like me, that some things that took place can't be explained away. Since then, I've been drawn to the subject and have felt this entity hanging around me silently, kind of just watching me. That's where I am now, just beginning to revisit these periods of intense strangeness. I've never really talked about this with anyone out of embarrassment, but I want to be able to talk about it to see if anyone else has been through these experiences that may be able to shed some light on it for me. I commented, "I'm at no offense, by the way, my imaginary friend I apparently had." If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and we will see you in the next video.